All right. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So, don't worry about the other stuff on the side, like over here. Just worry about the stuff like right down in the middle, right? All right. So if we started at -10, I use, and feel free to stop me at any point. If we started at -10, that is the traumatic event literally just occurred and or there is like active repression. So like, people who have been sexually abused that sort of like disassociate completely and repressed memories. Active means it's still being repressed. So that's like the absolute worst spot to be, right? And so I try, as I've talked with people about it, I also throw my own personal anecdote of like this has been the experience with my dad, like my dad being murdered when I was 18. I've gone through each one of these stages. And so -10 just happened. Every single step up is a step of growth, right? So next step of growth is survival, which is either fight or flight, or it's the overcompensate or isolate. I became an A+ student after my dad died because I just threw myself into school and was like, I'm just going to focus singularly on one thing, but isolated in a lot of different ways. Next step is -8, which is like the numb dissociative stage. If you've ever been through something really rough, you know exactly what that feels like. Just don't want to live, don't want to do nothing, whatever. -7 is one of three sort of like barrier points or boundary points of like, okay, we've reached a different stage. And I think this is going to be the -7 through -5 is ultimately where I've started to learn. Like, I think that's where my thesis is ultimately going to say this is where the church needs to live, right here. So there's the next step of growth is this assimilation attempt, right? I'm going to try and get back into normal life, whatever that looks like. What often happens is there becomes frustration with the simulation. Why aren't people understanding that this is what my reality is? Why aren't they being more sympathetic? And then there's consequences of it, which could look like a broken relationship. Um, making some really bad choices. Just the simulation didn't work, and so there's consequences that follow. Next step is there is awareness that trauma is even present, because even all those attempts to make, an assimilation back into whatever real life is, a lot of the frustration and consequences come because people just don't realize, okay, this situation genuinely affected me. So just an awareness is still at a -4, right? But -3, we get to the confrontation of the trauma and what I kind of call like attempted boundaries. And what I mean by that is like, I'm going to try and cut that toxic person out of my life. Maybe that person isn't really toxic, but you're trying your best to be like, okay, I got to change something. Number two would be the awareness of the need for change or for challenge. Like, okay, maybe I'm the person who needs to change, or maybe something in me needs to be challenged. -1 is ready to be challenged. If someone were to offer it to me, all right, I can take it. And then we get to 0, which is just reality, acceptance. Like, okay, we're just starting at even ground. We're not great, but we're also not horrible. Very even keel. So then when we go all the way up here, um, into the growth. So, right. So now we're going from PTSD to post-traumatic growth. First step, positive direction, is a desire for growth. And notice the words are different, ready to be challenged. Okay, this assumes there's been a challenge. Now I actually want to grow. 2 is a commitment, writing something down, actually saying, making a plan. I'm going to do this. And then the next step is the actual first actionable step of growth. Whether it's the first time you go for that run when you try and lose weight. It's that first, all right, I am gonna, I can trust men, or I can trust this authority figure. Next step is consistent behavioral change over a long period of time. And then I think this one's really important to public recognition of changed behavior. Other people stepping alongside and being like, okay, I'm seeing the change here. And that public recognition is really important for people that have gone through traumatic events. And then net 6 is positive experience, negative memory. If I use the experience with the example with my dad, hey, I'm so happy that I'm marrying my wife. I really wish my dad were here. Positive first, but it's still there's still negative there. And then we get to the repair stage, and I'll go over all that. But the repair stage, which 7 is active boundary setting. When I think about my mom, the active boundary and healthy boundary out of growth I've learned is I am willing to be a part of your life, but alcohol cannot be a part of the equation. If it is, it takes me down this scale, and I this is not an area where I want to keep going down, and I've tried, and so active boundary setting. These are sort of the, and it's again, it's to stay repaired.
Mhm.
Um, Negative or +8, positive memory loss. This just happened to me. God is my witness. My dad was killed on January 9th, 2009. Um, my wife reminded me about it at 8 p.m. like last week because I've gotten past a point where I'm like, okay, yeah, like I actually kind of forget his birthday. I never thought I would, but I actually am.
Mhm.
9 is contentment, right? Which is different from gratitude, but just okay, I'm fine. And then 10 is actually a stage of gratitude. So before I get to where that -5 and 7, this is sort of like if you see the stages, what we talk about, or what I say here is like a -10, it sounds like this isn't my reality, right? This is an emergency. Once we sort of once we make that first assimilation attempt, it's sort of like waking up from surgery, right? And it kind of sounds like, hey, this is always going to be my reality, or how is this sort of like this feeling of despair? But once we get up to, defining reality, it looks like, hey, is this always going to be my reality? Like sort of like just curious, or I guess this was always just sort of like this acceptance versus this defiance. And this is what I love seeing is from right here, if we go to -10, true post-traumatic growth from an incident is sounding like this isn't my reality of denial to I can't imagine a life or reality without this happening. I think about that with you know, my wife and I's like infertility for, 5 years and miscarriages. I think about that with my dad. We've genuinely gotten to a point where we're like, wow, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but I would be so bummed if I did not have this experience. That sounds weird, but I think that's what true post-traumatic growth looks like.
Mhm.
So if we think of wound,
Mhm.
right? This is where I think it's super important. In each one of these stages, it's a different type of wound. And all the way until you make that first assimilation attempt, it's like an amputation, right? It's not a small thing. This is a life or death scenario, and the type of care that's needed is a surgery or tourniquet. We don't try and, encourage rah rah. If someone really is in this space, it's like we have to stop what we're doing, throw out all the rules, and just make sure they're okay, right? Then you get from all the way from that first assimilation attempt to desire for growth. It's like this deep laceration or this deep wound, and it doesn't need a bandage. It needs something like gauze and stitches, something that's a little bit more. It's going to be long term, recovery, but it's not an amputation. And then up here, you've got, from desiring to grow to having it be a positive experience, negative memory. It's still a scab or a light wound. It becomes more of a scab, but it's noticeable. It's not painful. But it's, or it's considerably, but that's the bandage stage. And then up here, it's a scar. Now, what's important about a scar is scars are more agitated or agitated more easily than new skin, so it still can be, damaged, and we're really just doing preventative work up here.
Mhm.
Here's the problem that we ultimately do. As someone who has, and as I've talked with multiple people about this particular subject, who has made multiple assimilation attempts, where we go down the scale further is when we actually play our part with the frustration and the consequences. If we think about it from a theological perspective, the whole idea of the incarnation, kind of what I've talked about is like the role of the church here is if we can actually help people skip number 6 and number 5 altogether, those are the types of people who have the ability to actually make like quantum leaps in growth.
Mhm.
Because if they don't have to suffer through that part of it, because that is a spot where people can easily get stuck. And so I'm just looking at some of my notes here. Like the job of the church would be to say, hey, a good thing to know about this is maybe we can kind of identify where someone is, and if we're starting to realize that someone's not really living in reality, and they're trying to make all these assimilation attempts, what does it look like for us to come? Maybe we're at that part where like we're at a 9, But just as Christ came down for us, but then also challenged us to grow, our job is not to pull them up with a rope. We've got to do our best to meet them in that space because that's where we're going to see the most amount of growth.
That's great. I honestly think this is so helpful to like especially in discipleship and any kind of care ministries, like the
Yeah.
importance. I think one thing that we can end up hurting people is that we're not really good at locating people in where they're at. Like I think we have like unfair expectations or yeah, just like not understanding how to care for them because we actually don't know how to locate them in their situation or in their trauma or where they're at. And so I feel like this visual, even thinking for my job and then whatever, and church as well, I'm like, I think it's so helpful to have something. I'm like, okay, when I meet with someone, when I do an assessment, I can kind of have some kind of idea of like, this is where I think that they're at, this is how they're explaining their circumstances. And then being able to see even like measurable growth. And yeah, no, Eric, I think this is really, really helpful.
Well,
It's a good
and they,
tool.
I really appreciate that. And that just reminded me, I knew I was missing something in that -6 or in that -7 to -5 stage. The church, where the damage gets caused, and I think we see this so often because what we're trying to fix so often is behavior, not
Yeah.
like actually trying to help people. And so what happens is for someone who's got an amputation, we're trying to offer bandages and being confused as to why they're bleeding out, right?
Yeah.
But then conversely, right? We need to recognize where people are growing because what might have been a laceration or a deep wound is now a scab, and stitching that up is going to only make it worse. Like, let's try and actually push them toward, because I think when I think about that specific example, I think about, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think about the like, I think so there's I think I told you about Rachel, that young adult last time that we met, the girl who always passes out,
Mm-hmm.
right? As I've gotten to know her more and as we've gotten closer, she's opened up and she shared just some of her past church experience. And part of where she felt so isolated was there's a difference between babying her and letting her take reasonable risks. Like for her, where she loves our community so much is like she passes out all the time, but I still let her go cold plunge, right? Like I let her come with our group, and then if she passes out, like we'll have to pick her up, but we don't treat her as so damaged, even though she is growing. But like there is a part where it's like when there is genuine growth, we have to be able to not start poking with a needle at scabs because that's going to make it worse. So it goes both ways. And man, I really, just like you were saying, if you could just have a cursory basic understanding of this, even just like the three different stages, not the very specifics, but the wound, the care, and what it sounds like. I think that if people walked around with that knowledge, man, our pastoral work, especially with students, would change a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, no, I think it's a really helpful tool. Like both this and the wheel. Like I honestly think you're on to really, really helpful resources. So I want to encourage you in that.